Okay, I was asked to do this workshop, and I got serious. Then, when I'm eating dinner, Alice said, "No, you got to be funny. If you're not going to be funny, go home." So that's just about as funny as I'm going to be tonight. Okay. This was entitled Immortality for Poets. And actually, I didn't pick that title. Whoever made up the brochure picked that title, but I said something similar to that. Before we get started, we need to define what a poem is. Because really what we're talking about is what makes an immortal poem. 200 years ago, when poetry was read like popular fiction is today, this would not be necessary. Everybody knew what a poem was. They knew if they read something that it wasn't a poem also. That has gone by the by. Because of poets like Walt Whitman, the line between poetry and prose became blurred. Oscar Wilde described and wrote what he called prose poems. They're beautiful, by the way. Until today, it appears justified for me to say that if an author calls something a poem, and a few people agree with him, then it is a poem. For the purpose of this workshop, we will adhere to the modern, looser definition of poetry. All of the opinions expressed in this workshop are my own. Anybody that ever talks to you about poetry, judges a poetry contest, you're at the mercy of their opinion. Their critique or commentary on poetry by anybody, I don't care who it is, college professor, famous author, whatever, is mostly subjective. Objective critique, spelling, adherence to form, etc., is less common. It is more common in form poetry. Of course, if you're writing villanelle and it doesn't look like a villanelle or sound like a villanelle, then you've made a mistake. And objectively, anybody can tell you that that's not a villanelle. So, we know that what you're going to listen to tonight is my opinion. But don't feel bad. Like I said, you know, if you lose a contest, it isn't because you wrote a bad poem. It's because the person who judged the poem doesn't have the same feeling for poetry that you do. That's all it is. And if you luck out and you have a kindred spirit with a judge, you're going to win. I actually had a judge tell me that once, one time when I did win. So, that's important. All right. Any poem that we wish to label immortal must meet 3 criteria. Number 1, it must have some age. Some of you will write poems today, or yesterday. And somewhere in the future, they may become immortal poems. But they can't be an immortal poem now because we just don't know. They haven't passed the test of time. We just can't tell. The number 2 criteria is immortal poems must be relevant in any era and must be easily read by everyone. Poetry written in obscure or ancient languages such as Middle English, for example, just do not cut it. I know what many of you are thinking. See, I'm a mind reader. I'm looking out here and I see all you going, what about Beowulf? What about Beowulf? Nobody really likes Beowulf. outside of a handful of literature professors who think it's just marvelous, most of whom have spent 2 or 3 years learning how to speak Middle English and to understand it. So they don't enter into my category of an immortal poem. Outside of Eddie's academic specialists, this poem is just too hard to slog through. And And the third criteria is an immortal poem must be one or more of the following. It must be beautiful, or amusing, or whimsical, thought-provoking, or finally memorable. Even if we do not remember the whole poem, there are poems that enter the collective consciousness of everybody in this room. And as soon as you hear parts of that poem, you're going to go, I know that, even if you've never read the poem. This first poem I'm about to read meets the test of time. It is relevant and thought-provoking. And I believe it is absolutely beautiful. Now, I'm not going to tell you the title of the poems, okay? I'm going to read the poems, then I'll tell you what it was. If I have even just a little sense, I will walk on the main road, and my only fear will be of straying from it. Keeping to the main road is easy, but people love to be sidetracked. When the court is arrayed in splendor, the fields are full of weeds, and the granaries are bare. Some wear gorgeous clothes, carry sharp swords, and indulge themselves with food and drink. They have more possessions than they can use. They are robber barons. This is certainly not the way of the Tao. Now that last line kind of gives it away. This is chapter 53 of the Dao Dick Cheney by Lao Tzu, and it was written 2,600 years ago. I would say it meets the test of time. It's next to the Bible. It's the most read book in the world. And one of the fascinating things about it was this was a man who decided to quit his job. He worked for the Imperial Archives, and he decided that he had led a useless life, and he was going to go out into the wilderness and just die. And some of his friends met him at the gate and said, "You can't go and die until we write down all your thoughts." And his thoughts are just gorgeous. That's just one of them. But that could have been written yesterday. This poem could not have been more relevant. Actually, sometimes when I read it, I read it like this. There's 81 chapters, and I flip through the book, and I stick my finger down, and I read wherever I'm at. And I've yet to find one that wasn't relevant to our lives today. Now, I'm going to show you something if I can find where I did that. This is a copy of the Dog Dick Cheney, and it's a really, really nice one. It has the writing in the original Chinese on one page, and then the English translation over here. I had a friend who was born and raised in China. He was the second son of the fifth concubine of his father. So that's kind of a really interesting man. He made about $500,000 a year. His salary was about half. And he was considered a failure by the family because the family were worth gazillions. Very nice. He had never ever read the Dao Dick Cheney. At the time that he left China, it was a banned book. People just didn't read it. So I bought him this thing. He said, it's absolutely beautiful. He just loved it. That's a little side story there.
Can we see the front of it again, Mike?
Yes, you can. And it will look just like this. It'll look just like this.
Who published it?
Black and white. And this one is published by... I have to open it up. My older brother gave me this.
Oh, okay.
And it is published... Oh, man. Still looking for the publisher.
Well, don't worry.
Oh, it's Random House. Vintage Books.
Random House, okay.
Yeah, it's Random House.
What's the title again?
The Dao Dick Cheney.
The Dao Dick Cheney. T-A-O-T-E and C-H-I-N-G. And Tao is, I'm only saying that because that's how it's spelled, but it's actually pronounced Tao. And I don't know why that is, but my Chinese friend said that's pronounced Tao. So. And it's been a bestseller for 2,600 years. That's pretty good. Now the next one I want to talk about. Well, first I want to state that this poem I just read you is the oldest poem I'm going to read. It's hard to find one that's older. This next one, I talked about poems that enter the collective consciousness, that everybody, as soon as they hear the poem, are part of the poem, they go, oh, I know that, even if they've never read anything by the person before. So I'm going to start out, and I will tell you that the first line, you'll instantly go, hey, I know that. Laugh, and the world laughs with you. Weep, and you weep alone. For the sad old earth must borrow its mirth, but is trouble enough of its own. Sing, and the hills will answer. Sigh, it is lost on the air. The echoes bound to a joyful sound, but shrink from a voicing care. Rejoice, and men will seek you. Grieve, and they turn and go. They want full measure of your pleasure, but they do not need your woe. Be glad, and your friends are many. Be sad, and you'll lose them all. There are none to decline your nectared wine, but alone you must drink life's gall. This isn't done yet. There's more to it, I think.
So who wrote it?
Oh, I'm not there yet. Feast, and your halls are crowded. Fast, and the world goes by. Succeed and give, and it helps you live. But no man can help you die. There is room in the halls of pleasure for a long and lordly train. But one by one we must all file on through the narrow aisle of pain. This poem was written 120 years ago. It's called Solitude. And it's by Ella Wheeler Wilcox.
Yay, I got it. She's my favorite.
She is. There is. This also goes along with staying power. There are Ella Wheeler Wilcox clubs that get together and just read her poetry. It's absolutely gorgeous. This is probably her most famous poem. Finally, I'm going to do a poem that breaks all the old rules. All the old rules of poetry get just busted to pieces in this poem. But this poem is redeemed because it is breathtakingly beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful poems I ever read. Now I've got to get it out. I got it in here. I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear, and whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are, my world, my true, and that you are whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root and the bud of the bud and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? That's E.E. Cummings. E.E. Cummings, I find him to be just a marvelous character. He writes his name, E.E. Cummings, all in lowercase. He writes his poems all in lowercase. He never punctuates. He doesn't follow a scheme in setting up the lines. If he has by only me as you're doing, my darling, I fear no fate. I fear is set off by itself, and it's not in line or anything. I mean, it's just the way the guy was. Also, I would tell you the title, only he never titled any of his poems. None of them are titled. This poem is so famous that if you Google E.E. Cummings, it'll say, Google will tell you, do you want to see I Carry Your Heart in My Heart? And it's absolutely gorgeous.
The thing generally is put the first words of the first line as if it's the title when it's published. Generally.
Yeah, that's what they usually do. They usually use the first line.
For example, title "What
But
Much of a
that
Much of a
wasn't
Wind."
how he felt about it. He didn't want titles, and he liked for people to not just stop at a poem. He liked for them to just read his book, you know. And this is just one of the poems, but he saw it as the whole work. Very, very interesting fellow. Now, this poem was written in 1952. It doesn't have great age, but it has enough age that it's immortal. And anything where Google automatically takes you to that poem when you ask about the author, believe me, that's an immortal poem. There are many more poets whose works are immortal. Edwin Arlington Robinson, maybe some of you have read him. He wrote Richard Cory. But what I like is everybody's read Richard Cory, or most people have. I like poems like Cliff Klingenhagen, which is one of his poems. But they're these little, beautiful portraits of people that lived in the town where he lived. That's what they are. He was just a genius at it. He was also, and there's another interesting thing about Robinson. He was the last bestseller poet. He was the last poet to make the New York Times top 10 bestseller list. It just doesn't happen anymore. Now, lyricists sometimes make the list, but pure poets just
There's
not
another thing
happen.
he done too.
What?
There's another thing he did in his writing. He would spend days upon days to get one word right.
Yeah.
He didn't settle for anything except what he wanted that word to be. And if it took a week,
Here's another guy you might have heard of, William Shakespeare. His stuff has lasted pretty well. And I have a joke about that. Shakespeare didn't actually write this stuff. It was another guy with the same name. I was actually told that by a professor of English literature who thought he was clever, and he was a little bit. Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, he astounded people when his books first came out. That's not a poem. It can't be a poem, you know, but it was. And then when people started writing just almost anything and calling it a poem, and you said, well, that's not really a poem, you know, it doesn't have flow, it doesn't have meter, it doesn't have certain things, they would always say, well, what about Walt Whitman? And I like to quote a politician, you're no Walt Whitman. People that say that, you're not a Walt Whitman. Now, one of the things I said that I liked was whimsy. Eugene Field was a master of whimsy. He really was. Just his poems were funny, but they were whimsical, and that's really hard to do. I think he's just a genius. Now, who else? I'm going to tell you what you do. You go to poetry.com, or there's several sites, and just look and read these guys, because these guys only live so long as they're read. You don't read older poetry, then the guy dies. He dies with his work. And it's just, it's a crying shame when that happens. Now that actually ends my talk, but I didn't take very much time. I took about 15 minutes. So I want to read one more poem. And if I can find it. Oh, I know what to do. You go back and you look in the index. That usually helps.
That's too easy.
Yeah, you're right. There it is. Page 10. It's right at the beginning. Okay. During World War I, some of the best poets that ever lived wrote gorgeous, immortal poems, and then died. This particular poem I'm going to read, the man who wrote it died a few days after he wrote it. The poem is titled, I Have a Rendezvous with Death. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes round with rustling shade, and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair, it may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land, and close my eyes and quench my breath. I have maybe I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death. On some scarred slope of battered hill, when spring comes round again this year, and the first meadow flowers appear, God knows 'twere better to be deep, pillared in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep. Pulse night a pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death. At midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous. Now this guy wrote this just a few days before he died. I think it's just marvelous. And there are just tons and tons and tons of these World War I poets. You can actually look up World War I poets. You'll get guys like Joyce Kilmer, I Think That I Shall Never See, a poem lovely as a tree. And they all died. There are actually critics in England that say the flower of their poets passed away in one war because there were so many of them that died.
Who wrote that last poem?
This last poem? Oh, I'm glad you said something. I forgot to tell you who wrote it. His name was Alan Seeger. And he was born in 1888 and died in 1960.
Can hear you.
Alan
He
Seeger.
was born in 1888 and died in 1960. And his name was Alan Seeger, Seeger. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.